Ron had survived plasma storms, asteroid skirmishes, and that one infamous training exercise involving a carnivorous shrub, but nothing prepared him for the moment an alien girl with long, elegant ears stepped into the middle of his patrol route and announced, with unblinking certainty, that she had chosen him as her future husband. His vehicle screeched so hard it nearly performed a backflip. She didn't flinch. She just tilted her head, ears swaying like they were listening to music he couldn't hear, and asked why he was making such dramatic noises when she had come all this way simply to claim him. Ron's first instinct was to call for medical assistance. Clearly someone wandering the neon forests of Astra 9 with that level of confidence was concussed. But before he could reach his calm, she seized his wrist and beamed as though he had just agreed to her proposal. Apparently, grabbing a warrior's wrist counted as step one of her people's courtship ritual, and apparently Ron had participated, accidentally, fatally. He tried explaining this was a misunderstanding. She tried explaining that misunderstandings were a romantic cornerstone of her culture. When he backed away, she nodded approvingly and told him his retreat of modest excitement was flawless for a beginner. When he sprinted, she cheered and declared that the chase officially marked Phase 2. Ron had no idea how he ended up running from a woman who looked human, except for those long ears that streamed behind her like banners of triumph. He also had no idea how she kept teleporting ahead of him with a soft flicker of silver light, landing in his path with the cheerful menace of someone very used to getting her way. By the time he collapsed against a glowing tree panting, she crouched beside him, ears perked, and praised his endurance. He tried insisting he wasn't participating in anything. She translated that into "he's shy," and nodded as if she had solved a cosmic puzzle. She introduced herself as Lysera of the Eightfold Star Clan, and immediately began listing all the reasons he was an excellent candidate. His bravery, his reflexes, his reasonable facial symmetry, and most importantly, the fact that his first reaction to her presence had been a startled yell, which, according to her people, indicated sincere emotional potential. Ron countered by explaining that startled yelling was his reaction to nearly everything on this planet, including squirrels. Lysera found this endearing. She informed him she had traveled 16 light jumps, bribed a navigational AI with poetry, and disappointed an entire council of elders just to meet him. Ron wasn't sure whether to be flattered or terrified. He leaned toward terrified, strongly. When he tried to return to his patrol, Lysera followed at his side, hopping over roots with impossible grace, commenting on everything she saw. She asked whether humans always walked this slowly. He said yes. She nodded sagely and said she admired his patience. She also admired his uniform, his boots, his breathing technique, and his ability to avoid tripping over things despite possessing only 2 eyes. Ron began to realize that arguing with her was like arguing with a meteor, loud, pointless, and guaranteed to end with him flattened. She insisted on helping him with his patrol, even though her version of helping involved startling the local wildlife and scaring his detection drones into brief, panicked shutdowns. Ron begged her to stop. She interpreted this as a polite invitation to continue. When he finally managed to get her to sit still, she leaned close and whispered that Phase 3 of their union would require introducing him to her mother. Ron froze. The word mother never sounded so threatening. Lysera assured him it would be fine, then added that her mother was known for her vigorous opinions and frequent use of dramatic weaponry, which did not reassure him. He explained, with every ounce of clarity he could muster, that he wasn't marrying anyone. She tapped her chin thoughtfully and said he was doing an exceptional job at performing the denial of emotional overload. Then she thanked him for committing so deeply to the ritual. Before he could argue further, a tremor rippled through the ground. Lysera sprang to her feet, ears forward, insisting it was a sign that destiny approved of their meeting. Ron pointed out it was more likely the unstable mining drill stationed 6 kilometers east, but she wasn't listening. She grabbed his hand, apparently an even more advanced stage of bonding, and pulled him toward the glowing horizon with the enthusiasm of a child dragging a toy. Ron stumbled after her, shouting about safety regulations, which she interpreted as a thrilling duet of warrior chants. As they reached a ridge overlooking the drilling site, Lysera leaned against him, calmly observing the chaos, while he desperately tried not to die from embarrassment or the dust cloud rising below. She whispered that the universe had aligned for them. Ron whispered that he needed a long vacation. She said she would accompany him. He said that was absolutely not what he meant. She replied that she understood perfectly and that it was adorable he thought he had a choice. By the time night fell, Ron had accepted one truth. Whatever destiny was doing, it clearly had a strange sense of humor. And as Lysera walked beside him, ears glowing faintly with reflected starlight, he realized that his life had just become far more complicated than any battlefield he had ever faced. Ron woke to the unsettling sensation that someone was staring at him, which would have been normal on a battlefield, but was significantly less normal in his barracks. He opened his eyes and found Lysera kneeling beside his bunk, her long ears perked, her expression bright enough to power a small starship. She announced that it was time for the first bonding trial. Ron announced that breaking into military housing was illegal. Lysera explained that she hadn't broken in, she had simply rearranged the concept of doors, which was somehow worse. Before he could demand clarification, she pulled him upright with the strength of someone who had trained by wrestling meteor gorillas, and within moments he found himself being ushered outside while the dawn air was still stretching. She led him into the neon forest, talking cheerfully about their itinerary. Ron tried to interrupt, repeatedly, hoping to negotiate the cancellation of every item she listed. Lysera nodded at each protest and answered with variations of "yes, that is why you will be perfect at this," which made no sense, and yet she said it with such serene conviction that he kept losing track of his own arguments. When they reached a clearing, he realized they were not alone. A creature sat before them, shaped like a lizard if a lizard had been designed by someone who disliked symmetry and believed all wildlife should have approximately 6 too many teeth. Ron took one step backward. Lysera clapped her hands and declared that the beast would read his emotional aura and determine whether he was capable of lifelong devotion. Ron suggested they instead use a questionnaire. Lysera dismissed questionnaires as cold and unromantic, then encouraged him to approach the creature with confidence. The lizard thing slithered closer, eyelids blinking independently like malfunctioning shutters. Ron whispered that he was extremely confident at staying alive by not approaching it. Lysera whispered back that bravery blooms under pressure. He whispered that he was allergic to blooming under pressure. She patted his shoulder and assured him the creature was very friendly, unless it tasted fear. The creature inhaled deeply. Ron decided this situation counted as an emergency. The lizard lunged. Ron leapt sideways, shouting something that did not resemble bravery in any language. Lysera applauded and called his evasive move delightfully strategic. The creature crashed into a tree, disoriented, and Ron used the moment to scramble over a rock, hide behind it, and reevaluate every decision he had ever made. Lysera coaxed the creature back with a melodic hum, then casually informed Ron that the beast had approved him. Ron, still clinging to the rock, asked how she knew. She said the creature looked fond. Ron pointed out it had tried to eat him. She replied that affection comes in many forms. He hadn't recovered from that ordeal when Lysera announced Trial 2, calming a starship that had become sentient out of boredom. Ron needed a moment to process the phrase, bored starship, but Lysera was already leading him toward a hangar where a sleek vessel thrummed irritably. Its lights flickered in patterns suspiciously similar to someone tapping their fingers. Ron asked why it was bored. Lysera explained that it disliked its assigned flight routes and spent most of its time complaining about predictable star patterns. Ron sighed, stepped forward and introduced himself. The ship beeped a greeting, scanned him, and declared his posture adequate but uninspired. Ron muttered that even machines judged him now. Lysera corrected him. The ship was judging him lovingly. He attempted to soothe the vessel by admiring its engines. The ship responded by listing its mechanical flaws. He then praised its interior layout. It asked whether he was mocking it. Desperate, he offered to adjust its navigation algorithm. The ship brightened immediately and affectionately nudged his shoulder with a robotic arm. Lysera clasped her hands, thrilled at their bonding. Ron privately wondered whether he had just gained a technologically advanced stalker in addition to the biological one already beside him. When they returned to the forest, Lysera declared that the third trial would be simple, sharing a moment of honest conversation. Ron insisted they skip directly to this trial next time. She sat cross-legged, ears gently swaying, and asked what he feared most. Ron answered truthfully, mostly because lying felt pointless at this stage. He told her he feared disappointing people, losing teammates, and dying in extremely stupid ways. Lysera listened quietly, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. She said that where she came from, honesty was the foundation of all unions, and that his courage in admitting fear was more impressive than any physical strength. He felt something shift in the air between them, something he didn't quite know how to name and wasn't sure he wanted to. But before he could say anything, Lysera brightened again and announced she was proud of him for completing all 3 trials. He corrected her by pointing out that he had completed them by accident. She countered that destiny rarely cared about technique. As they walked back toward the outpost, Ron realized he was no longer trying to escape her. He was still confused, still overwhelmed, still utterly uncertain how he had become part of an alien courtship ritual, but he wasn't running. Lysera noticed his silence and asked if he was thinking of her. He said no. She said that meant yes. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, because somehow, someway, she was probably going to call it another sacred sign of compatibility, and he wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. Ron had faced many terrifying things in his life, but nothing prepared him for meeting Lysera's mother. The matriarch arrived in a vessel so massive it cast a shadow over half the forest, humming with enough energy to fry an entire continent by accident. Ron stood beside Lysera, trying not to sweat, trying not to run, and trying very hard not to imagine being disintegrated by a disapproving parent. Lysera, in contrast, bounced excitedly, her long ears flicking upward at the sight of the descending ramp. She squeezed his hand and promised she would protect him if her mother attempted traditional objections. Ron asked what that meant. She said it involved shouting, dramatic threats, and occasionally throwing a small asteroid. Ron's soul quietly left his body. The matriarch descended with the slow, regal fury of someone who believed the universe existed purely to inconvenience her. Her long ears were adorned with shimmering bands, and her gaze swept over Ron with the intensity of a scanning laser detecting flaws. Ron offered a respectful greeting. She responded by demanding to know why this human thought he deserved her only daughter. Ron opened his mouth, realized he had absolutely no idea what to say, and closed it again. Lysera stepped between them, declaring she had chosen him, and that was the end of the discussion. Her mother replied that it was the beginning of a much bigger discussion, preferably one involving interrogation chairs. Ron raised a hand, trying to explain that he wasn't trying to claim anything, least of all ownership of her daughter. The matriarch narrowed her eyes and accused him of humility-based manipulation, a strategy she found deeply suspicious. When he stammered that he was simply trying to survive, she nodded grimly and said survival was the first requirement in her clan's marriage evaluations. Lysera beamed proudly as though this were a sign of enormous progress. Ron considered faking unconsciousness. Before the confrontation escalated, the ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't the mining drill. A surge of pulsing light burst from the matriarch's ship, accompanied by the unmistakable roar of something alive, enraged, and extremely oversized. Lysera whispered that the ship's containment field must have destabilized. Ron asked why her mother had a containment field. She said she kept dangerous creatures for political leverage. Ron realized he had absolutely married into the wrong family. A massive shape emerged from the ship, an energy beast, half plasma, half shadow, flickering like a storm trapped inside a living shell. It barreled toward the forest, screeching, and Ron instinctively pulled Lysera behind him, even though she was objectively the more powerful one. The matriarch barked orders, but the creature ignored her. Ron knew running wouldn't help. So he did the one thing that came naturally to him. He acted. He grabbed a discarded stabilizer rod from the ground and charged directly into the creature's path, yelling something between a battle cry and a desperate apology to the universe. Lysera darted beside him, matching his pace with sparkling excitement. She explained mid-sprint that the creature was vulnerable to synchronized strikes. Ron said he didn't know how to synchronize anything. She grabbed his arm and dragged him into rhythm. The two of them lunged as one, Ron driving the stabilizer into the creature's core, while Lysera unleashed a burst of controlled energy. The beast shuddered, releasing a wave of heat that knocked them backward, then dissolved into bright, harmless sparks. Silence followed, broken only by the matriarch's astonished inhale. Lysera turned to Ron with shining eyes, clearly thrilled that they had just saved the planet together. Ron tried to stand and immediately fell over. Lysera helped him up, calling his performance spectacular, heroic, and moderately graceful, a compliment he decided not to question. The matriarch approached, her expression unreadable. Ron braced himself for annihilation. Instead, she placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and declared him unexpectedly competent. Lysera gasped and whispered that this was the highest praise her mother had ever given anyone. The matriarch added that, although humans were squishy and prone to emotional spirals, his willingness to protect Lysera proved he was worthy of consideration. Ron thanked her, though he suspected consideration meant she still might vaporize him if he sneezed incorrectly. Lysera announced triumphantly that this meant approval. The matriarch corrected her, saying it meant conditional approval pending future evaluation. Lysera interpreted this as a wedding invitation. Ron didn't understand how her translations worked, but for the first time, he didn't feel an urge to run. As the matriarch returned to her ship, Lysera clasped Ron's hands, her ears dipping in a rare moment of gentleness. She asked if he now understood why she had chosen him. Ron looked at her, the determined girl who had chased him through forests, dragged him into trials, and then fought beside him against a creature made of pure chaos, and he realized something had changed inside him. He wasn't afraid anymore. Or rather, he was still terrified, but for entirely different reasons. He didn't want to lose her. He took a breath and admitted that maybe, just maybe, he didn't mind the idea of staying by her side. Lysera froze, eyes wide, and then burst into a joyful squeal that echoed through the trees. She declared this the most romantic confession in the history of all known galaxies. Ron insisted it was a cautious admission, not a confession. She told him to stop being humble and accept that he loved her. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because the truth fluttered in his chest like a starship warming its engines. When she leaned against him, long ears brushing his cheek, he didn't pull away. He simply stood there, letting his new reality settle, a future filled with strange customs, impossible creatures, infuriating rituals, and a girl who would walk through black holes for him. And for the first time, the idea didn't frighten him at all.